So in my early 20s, I was a youth worker. And I remember in 2011 being invited to an event that was for youth and community workers that was looking at the Bradford riots of 2001 from the 10 years on. And, you know, there were some really interesting people there. There was the really cool, like, older people of colour, and there's also a strong police presence and a strong, kind of presence of the local authorities. And I remember feeling that, like, there was a history of the riots of 2001 that was being quite radically whitewashed. And one of the things about those riots was that they were met with such severity and with such brutality, and they actually caused so much damage that a lot of people in the city never really wanted to think about the structural things that were going on there before the riots began, let's say. And it got to the turn of questions from the floor, and people who know me will know that it's very difficult to shut me up in times like that. So I used my opportunity to speak to make some points about the structural levels of racism that still exist in the city, the fact that Asians still live in the worst housing mostly, the fact that even though 20% of the city, something like that, is British Pakistani or Kashmiri and stuff, like there's hardly anyone in a position of leadership in the city that comes from that community, where especially if you discount positions that people have made for themselves by either starting a business or being elected to them. And just when I finished speaking, I was approached by a couple of guys, one who's dead now, a guy called Abby Raymond, who were old activists from the Asian youth movement times. And they said to me, like, you talk like the olden days, basically. And they invited me to, so 2011 was not only the 10-year anniversary of the Bradford riots of 2001, it was also obviously the 81, 91, 2001, like 30th anniversary of the Bradford 12 and the exoneration of those Asian youth movement activists. And so I was invited to this 30-year anniversary of that. And I got to meet people like, I hung out with Abby, hung out with Tariq Mahmood, who was kind of defended himself in court and became known as this figure. And it was insane. It was absolutely insane. It was weird. Like, I was just there, like this kind of like kid in my 20s, and there was these older guys who I'd heard about, these older women who I'd heard about, and I knew certain stuff. But I knew, for instance, that they'd done all kinds of like international linkages and stuff. But then we're at this event, and Layla Khalid, the famous Palestinian freedom fighter, like sort of sends a message via Skype of solidarity. It was mad. And I remember talking to people and talking about the court case and stuff. And one thing that I won't forget, look, I've got all kinds of political differences with these people, and having respect for people doesn't mean you think they're always right. Quite the opposite of it. Do you know what I mean? But I do remember someone talking about Tariq's speech when he's defending himself in court, and I remember the line, and these things circulate like legends, so it may or may not have actually been said. But I remember the line that he said when he was like talking about his own experience. He said, look, racists and fascists in this country say, if you don't like it, leave Britain. Do you know what I mean? If you don't like it here, leave. And he goes, well, where am I supposed to go? Let's say I go back to wherever my family are from, supposedly from. In the sky, circling above me, there'll be RAF jets. There'll be, British aircraft carriers just off into the sea. He goes, I could leave Britain. Britain won't leave me. Hello and welcome to the first episode of The Colour of Our Politics, a podcast by me, Javad Alipoor.
And me, Tanya Vital.
It's a podcast that we've started to make because over the past years, we've seen how much the conversation about the heritage of colonialism, anti-racism, the struggle against racialized oppression and so on, how that keeps developing and developing. On the one hand, we have magnificent social movements all around the world, like Black Lives Matter, like the Kill the Bill protests, like uprisings all around the world. But at the same time, we see harsher, or indeed the revealing of harsher, more oppressive methods than ever before. So Black and Asian people dying at much more radically bigger rates of COVID than white people in this country. The unfair and completely different rate at which the recession is affecting Black and Asian people, not to mention, obviously, the ongoing problems of police violence and lack of good quality housing and so on. And obviously, what we've got to talk about right now is the government report into institutional racism. I think it's Lord Whitewasher's institutional racism report to just come out, sort of gaslighting this whole process. I think it's fair to say that on one hand, both of us have been inspired by some of that stuff and terrified by some of the other stuff. But I think what's been clear to both of us is most of the conversation that's been had about this is a conversation which is, to be honest with you, American-centric, and largely involves people comparing their history to what's happening to America in a not hugely thoughtful way. And if it's American-centric, it's also a little bit London-centric. And me and you, we happen to come from Bradford, don't we? And I think it's really interesting to start this podcast there in the heritage of people kind of like us, in a city which, unknown to some, has for the past 200 years been a hotbed of anti-racism and movements led by people of colour.
Absolutely. Bradford's going for the City of Culture bid in 2025, and as a city, we're doing a lot of soul searching. And one of the things that keeps coming up is what does it mean to be Bradfordian? And everybody keeps saying, oh, Bradford's a radical city, but very few actually know what that means. So the fact that we're starting here and we're going to start to uncover some of those stories is brilliant. And just to reiterate your point, and I bang on about this all the time, a lot of this discourse around race is very Americanized and is very London-centric. And actually, I'm glad we're doing this podcast because we need to kind of reclaim some of that narrative a little bit.
Because it's natural that race will work in slightly different ways and the struggle against it will work slightly in different ways. I mean, the obvious difference between Britain and America is that America begins its life as a settler colony built on slavery, with slavery and the genocide of the Native Americans at its foundation, whereas the UK begins its life as the dark heart of that empire, if you forgive the do you know what I mean? If you forgive the slightly ironic usage of that idea. So clearly these things are going to work in slightly different ways. That's not to say there's not things you can learn from things, but you can't just take one thing and apply it in a different context. And look, we're both professional Yorkshire people. Do you know what I mean? So on one level, we would love to just spend our life banging on about Yorkshire and all this stuff. But the thing is, when we're talking about Bradford, it's not just talking about Bradford. The reality is, in Cardiff, in South Shields, in all these places around this country, there's been communities of colour, mixed race communities, anti-racist struggles for a lot longer than people realise, I think.
This is one of the things that's really important to me. We've got the stereotype of a working class town, meaning white working class, flat caps and terraced houses. And actually, Bradford sits as a bit of an oddity in all of that because it's been a heavily multicultural city for decades. And beyond that, it's been a prominent city in the fight against fascism.
Yeah, man. And in this episode, we're going to talk a little bit about one of the most important moments of that anti-racist struggle. It's been talked about before, but I think what we're going to do differently is, we're going to talk about the Asian youth movement and the movement of the Bradford 12, basically young Asian kids who organised to beat the fascists, who at the time would go, it's a horrible phrase, but quote unquote packy bashing every Friday after they'd been out drinking. Groups of young people who organised to drive those fascists off the street, and actually won a famous court case in 1981 on the grounds that they'd been making petrol bombs to throw at these organised racists, and they won that court case on the grounds that they had the right to defend their own community, which is an insane thing. And we're going to talk about that. But I think it's probably worth just talking a little bit about how the rest of the series is going to pan out as well.
Yeah, I'm really excited. Like we've mentioned, we've got a really wide range of decisive moments of truly British history, ranging back as far as the 1800s through to the 60s and 70s. Then we stop off at the 90s, right up until present day.
And I think what we're trying to do really is go, there's a lot of people who are thinking about these questions right now, who are going what, even even the idea of what we call ourselves as when our communities come together. There's a whole debate over the usage of the word BAME. There's like, do we use people of color? That's an American phrase. Some older people don't like that because it reminds them of being called colored, which obviously there was a whole fucking battle against in the 70s because for obvious reasons, because it's racist, and all these kinds of things. And so I think what we're trying to do is not have some stupid argument about use this word, don't use that word. This is what you should think. This is what you shouldn't think. But about going, look, these are the ways in which over the past 200 years, Black people, Asian people in this country have fought back against, the kind of racism and imperialism at the heart of this country. And this is how it's happened in the past. And then perhaps we can try and work out how it might happen in the future or keep happening in the future.
Yeah, I feel like we've been through a period of what feels like inactivity in some ways. And there's been a generation missed of these stories being passed down, this knowledge being passed on. And, instead of what feels like us trying to recreate the wheel, I think it's important that we look back to see where we've been, to save us some time so that we can know where we need to go.
Absolutely. And I think that's why it's interesting for us to just dive a little bit into the story of the Asian youth movement, because we're kind of the age where we're like a half a generation away from these people. But I don't know about you. For me, this was like a legend that kind of hung in the air. Do you know what I mean? Like I always say, I live in Manchester right now, and, there's parts of Manchester where do you know what I mean? Everyone's big brother used to sell cocaine to Noel Gallagher.
Oh yeah, I know the ones, the famous town fables.
With an older generation than that, there's the famous story about when the Sex Pistols played in Manchester, and supposedly that's what started Factory Records and all this stuff. And if you talk to white guys who are about 45 in Manchester, probably about 30,000 of them were supposed to have been at that gig. Now,
yeah, of course, they were all there.
The venue only had a capacity of 500. Do you know what I mean? And in the same way, in a slightly more interesting way, in Bradford, there's a whole layer of people I know a little bit older than me who will tell me that it was when with like a lot of immigrant communities, that first generation of Bradford, largely Pakistanis but more broadly Asians. That first generation, they had that first generation vibe of keep your head down. This is not your country. Just work hard. Do you know what I mean? If people shout abuse in your street, just walk past. Let them spit at you. That kind of thing. But then a good generation of kids grow up who go, "This is our country. We're not going to put up with this stuff." Get involved in different kinds of politics and so on. And I know a bunch of guys who will say, or a bunch of boys and girls who will say, "Oh yeah, the first time, like when this group of lads had come down and everyone said, turn your lights off and close your curtains and let them go past. The first guy who went, that's it, I'm going outside and I'm having it out with him. Oh, it was my cousin, whoever." Yep. And so what's interesting about this for us, I think the story is not just the story of the Bradford 12 and the Asian youth movement existing in Bradford, but for people of our age and younger, what that myth means. So I suppose an interesting place to start is to just go, who the fuck are we? Do you know what I mean? Who is Tanya Vittal? Who's Javad Alipoor? What's our heritage and how did we come here?
Yeah, good place to start. So my dad is from the Commonwealth of Dominica and my mum is from Doncaster in South Yorkshire, both of which have a rich lineage of resistance and activism. So my dad's country is renowned for its maroon camps and revolts against slavery. And my mum's home city is obviously known for some of the biggest miners' strikes of the modern day. It's almost kismet then that they would then meet, and I would be born in Bradford, another city very well known for its fight against fascism. And, we've both been around for both of the Bradford uprisings. What I will say, though, that is, even though this stuff is kind of, almost in my DNA, the specifics of it, I'm not as well read about it as you are at all.
I don't know. I mean, it's a very kind thing to say. I sometimes joke that I basically I memorize the facts off the back of cereal packets. And People mistake that as erudition. But yeah, I mean, my family background is mixed as well. My father is from Iran. We're from the northwestern, originally from the northwestern bit of Iran. My mum is, a white Yorkshire woman with my mum's maiden name. This is where I really play the Yorkshire guy. My mum's maiden name was Exley, which is a name attested to a village in Yorkshire in the Domesday Book, man. So like
Oh, wow.
old school West Yorkshire. Do you know what I mean? But yeah, my dad comes from Iran. So unlike a lot of the first Iranian immigrants into this country who come from a very elite background, tied to the old ruling class, which was the ruling class, the Shah's regime, the monarchy,
Yeah, yeah.
who were largely through the 19th and 20th century were largely like kind of you could say compradors for Western colonial and imperial interests. We don't come from that background. We come from we come from basically kind of peasant stock on the Iranian side, in this area called Iranian Azerbaijan. We don't come from the kind of very narrow westernized elite who were the beneficiaries of kind of the semi-colonial and imperial deals that the elite were making with over oil and so on. Like literally, like my Iranian grandma was like 12 when she got married. It's a funny story, man.
12? Oh,
She was
wow.
like, yeah, she was like 12 and she married like a 24. My grandpa was like 24 when they got married. And the whole story in my family was they got married for love. Like they weren't, do you know what I mean? It wasn't like arranged or whatever. So like that's just like two generations or whatever, but it's like a completely different fucking peasant world. Do you know what I mean? And my dad's lot are like typical of the people who made the Iranian Revolution, basically. So peasants 2 generations ago went off to university. It was the 60s. It was all a bit the Tet Offensive. It was all a bit Malcolm X, and it was all, funnily enough, a bit Islamic fundamentalism, but in a way that gets sort of forgotten about. So my dad gets chased out of Iran because he's against the last regime. He's an Islamic fundamentalist, but he meets my mum in a disco in Leeds.
Of course he
And
does.
people, I think sometimes people don't really understand what quote unquote Islamic fundamentalism meant back then. In any case, we grew up on the white side of Bradford, and that's who I am, I suppose. So I've always grown up with like politics in the air. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I don't think my parents were overtly political, but I do think being brought up in Bradford, you kind of don't have a choice.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I would ask you this question. I think it's interesting. Look, this is not like fucking mixed race psychoanalysis podcast times, but like I think there's something interesting about people of mixed heritage. I sometimes say like you either own it or it crushes you. Do you know what I mean? Like some of the most inspiring people I know in terms of like just not giving a fuck and being in charge of their own narrative and I mean doing their own research into who they are people with mixed heritage. And then some of the most like sort of like meek, pushed around, apologetic people I know are also mixed.
Okay, so even in
So
my own family, if we're talking stereotypes and memification, I would definitely be classed as the Black Panther in my family, compared to my siblings.
yeah, funny man. So yeah, we were talking about the Asian youth movement and stuff, weren't we? And I don't know how much our listeners will know about this. Obviously, there's like a bunch of really cool books around. People. There's an Andy Ramamurthy's book, Black Star, Britain's Asian youth movement. Some of the people who were involved with it, Tariq Mahmood wrote a novel about those times. More sort of slightly right wing people like Kenan Malik have also told the story of it. But I suppose for us, it goes. But what do we know about it as when growing up in that city, a city that to be honest with you, like right up until 2001 had a history of like fighting back, physically fighting back against racist groups. What beyond that, 2000 and I don't know if you remember the famous viral video of the EDL guy getting knocked out in Bradford City Centre.
Yeah, when they came to the station and didn't get much further than that, of course.
Absolutely. So, if I said to you Asian youth movement, if I said to you Bradford 12, what comes into your head?
So these are things that you kind of hear as a kid. I heard about the Bradford 12, the saying the Bradford 12. I knew about the Asian youth movement from some of the reading I've done over the years. And obviously the iconic picture of the guys outside the court, it looks like when they got exonerated. But other than that, I didn't know the story in its entirety at all.
Yeah, interesting, man. Interesting. I mean, I think like to get a bit of a handle on it, like, if you go back, as I say, like if you go back to the 70s, you get this quite standard story of waves of immigration, where often the first generation are more conservative than the kids who grow up for all kinds of reasons. But what's, I suppose, key to understand, one of the things about the Asian youth movement is that there was a background of Indian organized labor in this country, mainly organized through an organization called the IWA, the Indian Workers Association. And the Indian Workers Association were largely tied to the Communist Party in India, which, I mean, man, like, there's a whole really, really interesting chat, which I am not qualified to lead, about the vagaries and weirdnesses and occasional heroism and occasional dreadful politics of the Indian Communist parties. In any case, they came out of, like, a lot of the very, very early 20th century Black and Asian movements in this country. They were very specifically tied to the struggle against colonialism in their countries of origin, so to speak. So this is in a context where clearly, there's been like South Asian working class people in this country for 200-300 years, going right back to sailors, so-called Lascars, they were called.
Yeah, the Lascars comprised of African, Caribbean, South Asian, and East Asian men.
Who worked for like the Merchant Navy and the British Navy and what have you. So out of this comes the Indian Workers Association. And there are obviously young Asian people. The 70s is a radical time for working class people broadly in this country. Young Asian kids who get involved in different kinds of left-wing groups and stuff. And the thing about the Indian Workers Association is it's very sort of, you could say it's Stalinist. Do you know what I mean? So it's tied to the Communist Party of India, it's tied to the Communist Party in this country, and it's tied, to the left of the Labour Party. One funny thing about the kind of Corbyn movement and stuff being that I think, because people don't know that history, people were saying that Corbyn had like sort of like Stalinist politics on Syria, like supporting the Russians and stuff like this. Actually, that's a really old tradition of the Labour left. Do you know what I mean? They've often had that energy. The point is that kind of leftist movement has a very complicated relationship with street fighting as well. So when sections of these young people, first of all, wanted to physically confront fascists, and also started to think that they were part of, these groups were part of the architects, where for better for worse they called themselves politically black people, from coming from Sivanandan and all that stuff. And one key thing that started to break them off from like the older leftist groups and stuff was that they believed in kind of self-organization of racially oppressed communities in kind of the two big practical things they were doing. One was self-defense against groups of fascists, and the other was organizing anti-deportation campaigns when people were getting thrown out of this country. And that's why the effects of that kind of political blackness are still seen in, for instance, what is now not a terribly great group called the Southall Black Sisters, if you know of them, very famous.
Yeah.
And they're largely South Asian. Do you know what I mean? And at this point, one of the things that sort of separated them from that older kind of leftism and so on was this slogan about actually self-organization. So one of the notes I made on this episode was it comes from Rama Murthy's book, and she talks about how the old anti-racist slogan, which you still sometimes hear from the white left, is the slogan is black and white, unite and fight.
Okay.
Yeah. But the Asian youth movement and then their comrades in the United Black Youth League and so on, they started changing that slogan to black people must unite, we're here to stay, we're here to fight. And that became like, we're here to stay, we're here to fight, became this really iconic thing for that movement. Basically, it grows up in a number of different parts of the country at the same time. So the first two big groups, as far as I know, are the Bradford group and the Southall group, and they have slightly different cultures. Basically, they have slightly different political cultures. The leadership in Bradford are people like Marsha Singh, who goes on to be a Labour MP, Tariq Mahmood, and so on. The Southall group I know less about, but one of the famous differences between the Bradford and the Southall group is that the Bradford lot, they spend their time, at the time there used to be a left-wing bookshop. My understanding is it's not been there the whole time I was there, but apparently there used to be 3 left-wing bookshops in Bradford. In any case, because there was this slight generational shift, people's parents weren't necessarily enamored of the idea that they were off, street fighting.
I bet.
So sometimes they get thrown out of the house and they would go basically kip at this bookshop. And so there was like real sort of like classic kind of like Leninist ideas that they were getting from the guys in these bookshop and stuff. And so the Bradford group set itself up as what they would think of as like, they would get very excited and say, we're like a communist party. We're like a group of revolutionaries. So with the Bradford group, you couldn't just join. Do you know what I mean? You couldn't just join. You had to apply to join, and then you had to be a candidate member for a bit. And then all the full members got to vote on whether you were a full member, like a clandestine.
That's how they weed out the spies, you see.
Exactly. I mean, if it's going well, that's how they weed out the spies. If it's going badly, that's how you make a cult.
True.
Do you know what I mean? Good luck to them. Obviously, they did some really, really impressive things. In any case, so they put it together in this way. The Bradford lot are very, very, very keen on like political education. If you join, you join. Do you know what I mean? There are jobs you have to do. You're not allowed to drink before a meeting or a demo or any activity, whereas those rules weren't the same in the Southall group and so on. You're not allowed to start a relationship with anyone in a family who you're defending against deportation. This always makes me laugh a little bit. Umberto Eco has this brilliant joke in Foucault's Pendulum where he says, if you ever look at a list of rules of an old organisation, he says people only ever come up with rules if someone's been doing it and it's got to be stopped. Do you know what I mean? But in any case, that's the political culture of this organisation. And as that stuff's going on, the incursions of fascists, sometimes organised, sometimes just racist thugs into Asian neighbourhoods, is being stopped by, groups of young men and young women who are taking it upon themselves to patrol their own areas, frankly, and stop this thing from happening. And this sort of develops and, it's difficult to think of now, like when if you go back to the 70s and 80s, the fascist groups would pride themselves on, they would march through the ethnic minority areas. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, often with police blessing.
Like for 20 years, 30 years, that's not been the case. I mean, even until the 1990s, the BNP used to go up Tower Hamlets. Do you know what I mean? I mean, you saw what happened when Britain first tried to do that a couple of years ago, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And I remember, Bradford does feel slightly different about some of this stuff. I remember when the EDL, when the English Defence League went to Bradford in 2010, maybe, which is a funny thing. Again, if you're talking about the particularities of race and stuff like this, I don't know if you recall, there was one Muslim member of the English Defence League who they brought to Bradford with them.
Yeah, they had him marching out on front.
Yeah, of course they did. Like, of course they did, like a little fucking mascot. In any case, like he was, the funny thing about him was, again, you've got to understand the particularities because he was called Abdul Salam and he was from Glasgow. Do you know what I mean? And he's from, specifically, he's a big Rangers fan. And so he's from the bit of Glasgow, which is just so sectarian that it don't matter what else you are. And like, if you're not a Catholic, you're all right. You know what I mean? But it was when the EDL came in those times, I was involved in the anti-fascist groups that were organising the counter-protests. And just about the same time, the EDL came to Leeds. And there was this incredibly interesting difference between organising in Leeds and in Bradford at that time, which was when you were in Leeds, right? So the police came down very, very hard in Leeds. People, anti-fascist activists were arrested 2 days before the demonstration. I had friends placed under restraining order, friends who spent 48 hours in the cells on charges that when they came were laughable. Do you know what I mean? There was a lot of counter-terrorism people doing up to all kinds of business, and particularly in terms of the police response to Black and Asian youth, was very heavy-handed. So the police were going from mosque to mosque and sort of telling the clerics that the line was, if you come to town, we will have you. Do you know what I mean? Don't think you're coming in, you're fighting. That is not happening. First of all, as if the guys who are going to come, or the boys and girls who are going to come and fight the fascists, they're not the ones at mosque on a Friday. Like, what's wrong with you? Do you know what I mean?
True.
First of all, but then when the day of the demo come, is it the hedgerow or whatever that comes, the big road that comes into town in Leeds?
Yeah.
The police were parked up, like where you come down onto the hedgerow from like Chapeltown and Hare Hills. The police basically had an unofficial kind of almost like a roadblock. And if you had if there was a car full of like Asian or black kids from like Hare Hills or Chapeltown coming down, the police were stopping them and going, "You turn around and you drive back out of town." Do you know what I mean? So it was a very heavy-handed presence. Now, in Bradford, there was a heavy-handed presence as well. There's helicopters everywhere. There's all this kind of stuff. But the difference was the police's like official statement to people in the community was much softer. And I remember seeing like a letter that went out that said, "You don't need to defend your community. Basically, that's our job," which is so much softer.
That's interesting. The softly approach, because I also have it on good authority from somebody else who was involved in community work at that time, that the police paid for busloads of kids to go to Alton Towers or whichever theme park it was that day, so that they were
there was a huge amount of like just sudden money to do youth work. Do you know what I mean? A huge amount of sudden money that just dropped from the sky. That's definitely true. But also there was still, nevertheless, there was a magnificent presence from largely Asian, but actually also white and black working class youth. And funnily enough, if you want to talk about discipline and stuff like this, and people behaving reasonably, the EDL were corralled near one of the train stations, near Foster Square train station. There was by the police. They were kettled there. There was a period where they tried to break out. They broke through police lines, at which point a group of largely, as I say, Asian, but with some racial diversity kids bust forward, physically confronted them, forced them back into the kettle, and then when they were rekettled, the kids just stood back again. Now, that's not the stereotype of how you would have thought, certainly it's not the racist stereotype of how you would have thought young people of colour, so-called, would defend themselves in their community. It seems to me a perfectly, as I say, disciplined and reasonable and measured way of dealing with these things. Perhaps not at the same like level of political organisation and analysis of the Asian youth movement, but it'd be interesting to get back to all that stuff, So just in the same way that like the Indian Workers Association and the older Pan-Africanist groups had tied their political analysis to the decolonisation of their countries after the Second World War, the Asian youth movements get really, really inspired by and radicalised in the good sense by links to international organisations. So Tariq Mahmoud tells a story about learning that the leader of the leftist Palestinians was a guy called George Habash at the time, who was a Christian, and this being a big moment for him and being like, oh, it's not about religion. Do you know what I mean? It's about a certain kind of colonialism. And also at the time, obviously 81, when this is going on, is around about the time of the Irish hunger strikes and so on. And actually, according to legend, the leader of the Irish hunger strikers, Bobby Sands, they were writing letters to each other, and he composed a short poem that was like read at their stuff. And by 1982, after the Bradford 12 trial has happened, and they've been exonerated, and they've proved that a community has the right to defend itself if the police aren't going to defend them, or if the police are being racist, and allowing that to happen, a bunch of the Asian youth movement from the UK were invited by the official Irish nationalist, or you could say Republican leadership, to participate in the commemorations of the Easter Rising, which is like the big day on the calendar of kind of Irish socialist republicanism.
I find this stuff fascinating because, if you're not from Bradford, you won't know that a lot of our vernacular and slang and colloquialisms come from Irish traveller vernacular. So like things like chav and chava, that is all from Irish traveller vernacular, and there's always been a great relationship between Bradford Irish traveller community and the Bradford Pakistani community, and obviously from this and the stories we learnt about the Chartist movement, this is where it stems from.
Yeah, man. I mean, like, there's, obviously, probably the second biggest wave of people brought to work in the early factories of Bradford were Irish immigrants from the West Coast. And there's a fantastic, I can't remember the name of the book, man. It's some like demented old Victorian history book that I found somewhere, where it's got this magnificent quote from a Tory councillor who's walking through Leeds Road, which is obviously, now again, people would think of it as an Asian area. It's actually a very diverse area. Do you know what I mean? There's a ton of Caribbean people. There's increasing amounts of African people, Middle Eastern people, a load of East Europeans, and obviously a substantial amount of Asians as well. So in like the 1890s, he's walking down Leeds Road. There actually used to be a drinking song about Leeds Road. There's hardly any pubs in Leeds Road anymore. There you go.
There used to be loads.
Yeah, and apparently in the 1890s there was so many that there was a famous drinking song about drinking yourself to death by having half a pint in each pub down Leeds Road.
I can imagine.
As I say though, this guy, this councillor, there's this brilliant quote from a speech he gives where he goes, "I walked down Leeds Road," and he goes, "It was disgusting. It was disgusting. The level of housing. You got these people. As soon as they move in, do you know what I mean? As soon as one of them comes, the rest of the family, the rest of the tribe has to come." And he goes, "The stench of their food. The stench of their food turns your stomach." Do you know what I mean?
Bradford, capital of curry, 8 years in a row.
Yeah. Well, of course, he's talking about the Irish. He's talking about the Irish, and he actually even goes. He goes, "You can walk all the way down Leeds Road, and not a word of English is being spoken." And he's talking about rural Irish immigration into the city. So plus ça change, plus ça même chose, as they say.
Yeah, the more things change, the more things stay the same.
So yeah, all this stuff is going on. The Asian youth movement gets kind of radicalized, and ultimately it splits because some really interesting stuff happens. So the response to this wave of radicalism, which, let's be clear, comes off the back of, it's not just the Asian youth movement magicked out of nothing, comes off the back of the 70s, which is a very radical time for working class people generally, comes off the back of the Brixton riots, the Toxteth riots,
Leeds riots.
Leeds riots. We could say uprisings, depending on.
Yeah, let's not use the language of the state.
Exactly. Is that you pay your money, you take your word, and like comes off the back of this stuff, and this big moment of radicalism, and the state. So this is a really interesting thing, man, because recently people have been having this chat about. And look, man, I'm not trying to say one thing or the other, but one thing that really fucks me off is this idea that people, say BAME, don't say BAME, I don't care. Do you know what I mean? I care about equality, and I care about ending police violence, and I care about dismantling the white power structure. But one thing that really fucks me off is this idea that, like, this rhetorical idea of, like, where does the word BAME even come from?
Yeah, there's always a lot of flippancy on Twitter. I didn't get consulted. Who came up with this word? These acronyms.
Yeah, and the idea is there's some evil white guy twiddling his mustache going, "Now you'll all be called BAME." Do you know what I mean? Which is A, it's stupid, B, it's historically illiterate, and C, what it actually kind of gets rid of is the lived real history of Black and Asian communities in this country carving out space, then some of them selling each other out, then some of them taking money from the government, then some of them fighting in a different way, where that what we have now is a settlement that comes from that history. It didn't just drop out the fucking sky. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I was thinking about this recently, and it's like we have a tendency to look at these things in isolation and not as a rich tapestry of interconnected events and those things happened then, which is why we are here where we are now. We tend to look at them as separate incidences, and I guess that's down to our historical literacy, like you said.
Absolutely, absolutely. So one of the things you get around the time of the Asian youth movement and after the Bradford 12 exoneration and so on, is you get like people starting to fall out with each other about different kinds of politics. People starting to take different positions on things. Obviously, what was kind of community defence and leftism in the UK starts to become something which is as much about having links to Palestine and freedom for Kashmir and freedom for Ireland and troops out and all this kind of stuff. And, because of the ins and outs of the solidarity campaign around the Bradford 12, you start to see fissures and fractures, and a couple of things happen. First of all, a bunch of the people who were Asian Youth Movement go into the United Black Youth League. And as far as I can work out, this shit all appears super, super murky. And I think one thing that's important to do about when you think about the stories of kind of the people who came before us is, it's important, and it's perhaps one shared cultural thing from the Caribbean and to Africa to the Middle East to India to Southeast Asia and whatever, is like it's very easy to like blow smoke up the arse of aunties and uncles. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And like not criticize your elders and stuff like this. Do you know what I mean? But actually, they got things wrong as well. And from what I can make out from reading about it, some of these splits are matters of principle. Some of them are just people falling out.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And so you start to get these splits. And one of the two big substantial splits happen, one of which is the idea that in principle, if you're a member of the Asian Youth Movement, you're not allowed to be a member of another group. Yeah.
Okay.
And that's because they were like, we don't want to get taken over by the white left, because the argument would go, okay, if you can be a member of the Asian Youth Movement and the Socialist Workers' Party, or the Asian Youth Movement and the Labour Party, or the Asian Youth Movement and the Militant Tendency, what's going to happen is, we, the AYM, have got this really cool thing with like literally hundreds of members in Bradford. And membership is a serious thing. Do you know what I mean? So you've got 200 people giving actual time in a city the size of Bradford. So what's going to happen is, these people from the other left groups will join. They'll use it to recruit for their group, and they'll just turn us into sort of a talking shop.
Assimilation, yeah.
At the same time as this happens, so Marsha Singh is the chair of the Bradford group, who goes on to be a Labour MP, and he kind of, on the one hand, is very eloquent in defending this position and kind of puts a stop to some of that work. But almost all of the time that he's in the Asian Youth Movement, he's also secretly still in the Labour Party. And so this starts to become a bit of a fallout and stuff like this. And then the big thing that comes in, obviously, when these uprisings happen, the Asian Youth Movement happen, the Thatcher government deals with it in two ways. And this is where we get into this chat around BAME and how it came to be and all these kinds of things. It deals with it in two ways. On the one hand, it gives some progressive reforms, when we get, as Sivanandan, who ran the Institute of Race Relations at the time, said, talking about, Trevor McDonald and Zainab Badawi and people like this being on TV. It doesn't matter how perfect your diversity policy is or your equality opportunity policy is. It turns out you just need some, as he would say, you need some black young people rioting in the streets, and then suddenly they find space for people.
Mm-hmm. Protest works.
So there's the progressive response you get given, and the money from the state and so on, and you also get the smashing down and the repression of other people. And one of the responses of this, in terms of the AYM, is the government going, okay, look, what we need is clever, erudite young people from Black and Asian communities to be building institutions in those communities. And perhaps you, the United Black Youth League, perhaps you, the Asian Youth Movement, could be part of that. So the government start offering grants in terms of the youth work or the community work, part of the political work people were doing. And one of the biggest splits in the Asian Youth Movement is about whether or not you can take this money from the government.
Right.
And actually then, it's in the process of all that stuff in the 80s that we start to see the development of what you could call, which we'll talk obviously more with Aaron about, you start to see the development of official multiculturalism. Do you know what I mean? And so you start to see these various different ways of describing people and so on, and the evolution of a way of talking, which perhaps lands with the idea of black, Asian, and minority ethnic people being a way to describe folks or whatever.
Okay.
Now, that's not to defend that phrase. That's just to say it's got an actual history, which we and our communities were an active part of, like sometimes righteously fighting for good things, sometimes selling each other out. Do you know what I mean? Like, but it's our history, like it or not.
It's interesting, isn't it? You know, the idea that our elders had some say in all of this, rather than it just being done to them. And you know, I guess the state went along with it because it's easier to be controlled when you're not a united front.
Yeah, for sure. And also you get, you know, and also there are like real sociological reasons why people sort of like struggle to see themselves as united in the same way in the future. Do you know what I mean? Like, you know, there are real kind of like differences in how people are living and stuff. And I think the difficulty is that they're not at all like obvious differences. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's not some simple scheme, like, you know, it's like a controversial thing to say, but it's like it's not like there's not a simple thing like the more Muslim you are, the more oppressed you are, or the darker your skin, the more oppressed you are all the time. That's not always true. Like, literally, the people who live in the worst, like just statistically, the worst housing in this country racially is lived in by Bangladeshis, first of all, and Irish travellers.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? They are the most statistically oppressed by housing in this country.
Right.
At the same time, clearly, like, although the Metropolitan Police beat, you know, Asians up at twice the rate they beat whites up, they beat black young men up at like 10 times. Do you know what I mean? So like these things intersect with each other in all kinds of complicated ways, I suppose, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, it's interesting. And to bring it back to our earlier point, you know, some of the importation of politics and ideologies and theories from America might not fit as snugly here. You know, we're complex in other ways. And we're going to touch on Afro-pessimism a little bit more in later episodes, but yeah, it's definitely something that we need to start discussing in a UK context.
Yeah, for sure, man. It's like, on the one hand, like, you know what I mean? Like, you have to be able to talk about the complicity of different oppressed people in different structures of oppression. I mean, like, I'm a man. Do you know what I mean? I don't like the word passing because, again, that's got a whole history, but like, you know, half the time people see me as some sort of Asian, half the time they see me as a sort of Cypriot with attitude. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, you know, I can see why.
Yeah.
So we're going to round up with a quote here that was written around the time of the Toxteth riots in Liverpool. It reads, "Subsequently, the heightened levels of antagonism between police and black communities led to 4 nights of unrest in Liverpool following the arrest of a black motorcyclist by police. The media coverage of Liverpool continued the image of black aggression and criminality. The Daily Mail reported the event was, quote, black war on police, end quote." And this is an article from the 1980s. It's definitely something that I especially want to explore in this series, you know, this idea of, well, here we have the Daily Mail in the 80s and the inciting and violent words of black war on police, when actually it was nothing of the sort. In fact, the opposite was true. When we go to look at the history of William Cuffy, there's a quote from the Times, you know, the black man and his party and the racist caricatures that went with it. I just kind of want to reiterate that the largely racist right-wing press in this country and the state have been acting in pretty much the exact same way towards people of colour since the 1800s and beyond. And again, for some reason, we look at these events as isolated incidents, you know, as something happens and then nothing happens for a few decades. But when we look at the history as a whole, there's a clear pattern that I guess we can study and take forward with us in terms of our activism. And perhaps, I don't know, maybe not be so swayed or indeed injured by tabloid spectacle and villainy.
Yeah, for sure. And we've got another quote, haven't we, about that similarity about how stuff is the similar role the press have played in various parts of the press have played at different times. Like so, anyone who knows much about Bradford will know the Telegraph and Argus has, let's say, a complex relationship to race, which has improved a lot over the past few years. But like, if you go back to the 80s, we've got this other quote from one of the Asian youth movement activists at the time about when when the Bradford 12 arrests were made, how that was reported in and blown out of proportion by the TNA.
It reads, I got a phone call to say that comrades had been arrested. By this stage, it was quite big headlines in the local newspaper, the TNA, Telegraph and Argus. Bomb factory discovered in Bradford. A number of people are assisting police with the inquiries. The two things didn't tally straight away. Bomb factory and half a crate of Molotov cocktails. But I think one thing it did highlight, it may have not seemed a big thing from our point of view, but it certainly was going to be made into a big thing. We're going to leave you with a quote from Amin Qureshi, who was a journalist at the time of the trial of the Bradford 12 and later became a member of the local council. And what's most compelling about this quote is that here is a member of the press full-bodedly defending these young guys who were on trial and were indeed making Molotov cocktails to defend themselves and their communities from fascist attacks. And not just defending those on trial, but drawing a clear line of demarcation that actually this is what's happening, this is why this situation has come about, this is how we've been systematically failed, and this is how we will fight back and support our brothers going forward. And it goes, our fathers, mothers, sisters and brothers are attacked and murdered in the street. The police do nothing. Our homes and places of worship are burned to the ground. Nobody's arrested. Families are burned to death. The murderers and firebombers speak openly of their organised violence against our communities. They're not charged with conspiracy. The politicians and police have failed us. Our youth are our only protection. These young men defended Anwar Dita, Jasvinder Kaur, Gary Pemberton and many others. Now they've been taken away from us. We must not fail them. We must fight to bring them back. They have defended our community. We must now defend them.
So that's been The Colour of Our Politics with me, Javad Alipoor.
And me, Tanya Vital.
If you've enjoyed it, please like the podcast, subscribe to it to get other bi-weekly episodes on whatever form it is that you download your podcast, share it, review it, and just, join in the conversation on social media.